Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I am NOORZAINI DAYINIE binti NOORZAINI from the group class MGT646 5G3 from UITM campus Kota Kinabalu, Sabah. In this video, I will be presenting the quantitative research method on topic the determinants of factors that affect inflation in ASEAN countries. Throughout this presentation, we will look at the background of the study and problem statement under the introduction in Chapter 1. Chapter 2 is the literature review, which will cover the theories and empirical studies. Then we have the data and methodology in slides 7 until 10. Continue to Chapter 4, the results of the test, and the last one is conclusion and recommendations under Chapter 5. Let's start with the background of the study in introduction. Inflation is a monetary phenomenon characterized by a decline in the purchasing power of a currency's unit of account, making it harder to keep up with the cost of living. Inflation measures changes in the prices of a wide range of products and services purchased by the generation population over a certain time period. According to the International Monetary Fund, the 5 member states of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations all strive for the same thing, which is a more equitable and sustainable economic expansion. One of the reasons for founding ASEAN was to facilitate economic integration and boost regional competition among the region's most populous nations, also known as the ASEAN 5, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. But in this study, we only focus on Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan, and Singapore. The problem statement that this study is focused on the factors that affect inflation in 4 ASEAN countries, which are Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan, and Singapore, by determining the relationship among the variables to investigate the factors with inflation as the dependent variable and exchange rate, government debt, and consumer price index are the independent variables. The objective of this study is to determine the exchange rate, government debt, and consumer price index that affects the inflation in those 4 ASEAN countries. The scope of the study is, as mentioned just now, it is to cover the factors that affect inflation in the 4 ASEAN countries. Multiple statistical analysis methods will be used to check the study's findings. Move on to Chapter 2. In this chapter, the primary focus is on the process of building the framework itself, in addition to developing hypotheses and a theoretical framework. Firstly, the theory we are going to look into is the quantity theory of money. According to Milton Friedman, 1969, the founder of monetarism and winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics, oversupply of money in an economy leads to domestic inflation under the monetarist model of monetary policy. He also convinced that changes in the general price level are caused only by shifting in the monetary stock or money supply, stating that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. This indicates that a percentage rise in the money supply will result in a corresponding percentage increase in prices. A rise in the money supply causes inflation according to this idea, but this is not accompanied by a rise in economic production. Next, we have the demand pull theory. The rise in aggregate demand was highlighted by John Maynard Keynes, 1883 to 1946, and his followers as the cause of demand pull inflation. Consumption, investment, and government spending make up the total demand. The inflationary gap appears when the value of aggregate demand is greater than the value of aggregate supply at the full employment level. The inflation rate increases in direct proportion to the size of the discrepancy between the total demand and total supply. The rapid rise in inflation during times of survival is mostly caused by unbalanced sections, branches, and or other economic resources that are compensated for by the inherent characteristics of market-based discipline. Continue with the empirical studies, we discuss about the variables identification. In exchange rate, Cheng and Tan 2002 determined that there is a negative link between inflation and currency exchange rates. According to Olatunji et al. 2010, exchange rates have a negative impact on inflation. Using time series data, he discovered which variables contributed the most to Nigeria's inflation. While according to the findings of Aurangzeb 2012, there is a high link between inflation and all independent variables. Then, consumer price index. There is a link between money expansion and consumer inflation over the long term according to a number of studies such as King 2002 and Gerlach 2004. Plus, it has been demonstrated by Bordeaux and Villardo 2004 that Ken and Smets 2004 that the lag between monetary policy and consumer inflation has led to asset price bubbles that are the result of policy. In government debt, Chang 1994 and Metin 1995 and Deret 2000 present empirical evidence that budget deficits have a major influence on inflation. Chang 1994 provides a theoretical forecast of regional input-output models by employing the pool technique to estimate intermediary transactions in Taiwan. In general, the conclusion suggests that budget deficits induce modest inflation owing to the issuance of government debt. According to Metin 1995, he studies inflation using a basic framework of sectoral interactions and concludes that fiscal growth in Turkey was a crucial influence in inflation. He believed that the surplus demand for money had a beneficial short-term effect on inflation. According to Deret 2000, he revisits the subject of the inflationary effects of Greece's increasing budget deficits, using the same data sample from 1957 to 1993 and model structure as Handroyanis and Papapetro 1997. He argues that their findings lack credibility as a result of several modeling and estimating issues. By addressing these issues, the results indicate that in addition to money growth, budget deficits have played a large and direct role in the inflationary process in Greece. Moving on to Chapter 3, where we will evaluate the data using the panel data with all the variables. As you can see here, and also I have mentioned earlier, the dependent variable is inflation. The independent variables are exchange rate, government debt, and consumer price index. As shown here is the empirical model of the study. INF represents inflation, EXCR is the exchange rate, GOVD is the government debt, CPI represents the consumer price index, beta 1, 2, 3 here indicates the partial coefficient of the variables. There are two hypotheses can be explained. First is null hypothesis that conveys the idea that any deviations from what has been thought to be true or observed in the past are entirely due to error. Next is the alternative hypothesis. It is the statement that expresses the opposite of the null hypothesis. In this study, the null hypothesis is that the independent variables have no effects on inflation, while the alternative hypothesis can be the independent variables have huge effects on inflation. Now let's take a look at the diagnostic testing. There are few tests that are usually to be carried out in research, for example, unit root test, pullability test, autocorrelation, multicollinearity, and heteroscedasticity. Unit roots are time series processes with an intercept and a trend that are non-stationary autoregressive. According to Sosvilla Rivera 1990, many economic models assume a unit root because economic agents use information available to them in a reasonable manner. These procedures are frequently employed in the fields of economics and finance, but they are also employed in other scientific fields. Pullability test is a test to determine the dataset's pullability, essentially examines the stability of the parameters. It can be performed across individuals and over time. Simply said, the test objective is to determine whether the same coefficients hold true across all subjects and periods of time. Autocorrelation, also known as serial correlation, it is often used with autoregressive moving average model and autoregressive integrated moving average model. Autocorrelation is possibly made to find repeated periodic patterns which can be utilized as a tool for technical analysis in the financial markets. Multicollinearity is a condition in which two or more independent variables have an approximately linear relationship. Multicollinearity occurs when independent variables in a regression model are correlated. Heteroscedasticity in this paper refers to a group of random variables where some subpopulations differ from others in terms of computed variability. The variance value or any other measure of statistical dispersion can be used to quantify variability. Given here is the flow of panel data. According to our study, the annual data is analyzed by using the panel data that have been collected from the World Bank data. The software used for the data analysis is Tata version 12. This software helps in the process of interpreting the data that has been gathered in order to precisely test the significance of the independent and dependent variables. The tests is used in this study include descriptive statistics, the unit root test, the pullability test, PBLM test, and the panel OLS Newey West method. Chapter 4 is basically discussing about the results of the data analysis. First, the descriptive statistics and normality. The table here displays the descriptive statistics findings. The results of the normality test also included in the same table. For mean inflation, the mean is at 0.3%. Meanwhile, for the independent variable, exchange rate has an average score of 3.89. As for government debt, it has a mean of 4.33%. The variable of the consumer price index 4.73% of mean. The standard deviation is a more accurate and detailed estimate of dispersion because an outlier can greatly exaggerate the range. The standard deviation for inflation is 1.15%, whereas for the independent variables, exchange rate, government debt, and consumer price index is 3.59, 0.72%, and 0.12% respectively. Then, the result of panel unit root tests using LLC and IPS are as follows, whereby the variables of INF, EXCR, G of VDT, and CPI tested on LLC method resulted 0.0198, 0.0001, 1.0 and 0.0036 respectively, and as for IPS method, the results are 0.7856, 0.7969, 1.0 and 0.0609 respectively. If there are large random effects in panel data models, the Bruce-Pagan-Lagrange multiplier test is employed to determine this. Based on the table shown, the BPLM test results in a p-value of 1.0, which is more than 0.05. Since it cannot be pooled, neither random effect or fixed effect regression techniques can be used to continue the process. The process will be finished using the panel OLS Newey West method. Because the BPLM test result is greater than 0.05, we use the panel OLS, which is the Newey West method. We can see from the result that the exchange rate shows a positive relationship with the coefficient of 0.005, while for government debt and consumer price index both show a negative relationship with coefficients of negative 1.24 and negative 0.91. The study employs static panel estimation techniques which include POLS, REM, and FEM to evaluate the determinants of inflation, government debt, consumer price, and exchange rate. The equation is calculated with the static panel estimation techniques. To choose between POLS and the REM, the Bruce-Pagan-Lagrange multiplier BPLM test examines the null hypothesis that there are no random effects. Then, in order to choose between the REM and FEM, the Hausman specification test examines the null hypothesis that REM is consistent and efficient. Likewise, if this hypothesis is rejected, then the estimation results from the FEM will be found to be more robust. To summarize this chapter, all of the data were run through Stata software to obtain the outcomes of various models or tests. Then the result shows that the dependent variable, which is inflation, was connected to independent variables. In our study, our main objective is to know the relationship between the exchange rate, government debt, consumer price index that has affected inflation to happen. To know if there is a relationship, then we came out with the data that we have found to make an analysis on it. Based on the result, the exchange rate has a significant impact on inflation. It is because the t-test value shows a positive number. Therefore, we are able to accept the alternate hypothesis and reject the null hypothesis. And to conclude, all the independent variables have a significant relationships in affecting the inflation of the ASEAN countries of Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan, and Singapore. There are some recommendations that can be taken into account from the conclusion of this study for future research on the same issue of factors that affect inflation. Firstly, the number or nature of the independent variable could also have changed. The addition of relevant factors such as money growth and unemployment can enhance the findings of research, as we can see being done by Rabiul Islam 2017, who used money growth and unemployment as alternative independent variables besides exchange rate in his study. That is all from me, NOORZAINI, DAYINIE, BINTI NOORZAINI, signing off. Thank you, everyone.